Italy was supposed to be the soft underbelly of Europe. That's what the strategists called it. The soft underbelly. As if war could ever be soft. As if death could ever be gentle. But when you're planning a war thousands of miles away, when you're moving pins on a map, when you're calculating casualties like they're abstract numbers instead of human lives, everything seems manageable. Everything seems like it can be controlled. Everything seems like it fits into a neat strategic framework. But Italy in 1943 and 1944 was anything but soft. Italy was a nightmare. Italy was a hellscape. Italy was a place where young men from Canada learned what it meant to be truly abandoned by those who claimed to command them. And what happened there, in the mountains and valleys of that beautiful but terrible country, is a story that has been buried in history books for far too long. This is the story of General Harold Alexander, one of the most celebrated British commanders of World War II. This is the story of Canadian soldiers who were sent into impossible situations with inadequate support and told to achieve the impossible. This is the story of how those soldiers, faced with abandonment and betrayal at the highest levels of command, rose to an occasion that demanded everything they had to give. And this is the story of how, in the mountains of Italy, approximately 100,000 German soldiers were killed by forces that had been abandoned, underestimated, and left to fend for themselves. This is a story about courage under impossible circumstances. This is a story about what happens when ordinary soldiers are pushed beyond the breaking point and refuse to break. This is a story that changed the course of the war in the Mediterranean. And this is a story that has been almost completely forgotten. The campaign in Italy began with such promise. In July 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, was supposed to be a demonstration of Allied power and coordination. American forces under General George Patton and British forces under General Bernard Montgomery were supposed to show the world that the Axis was finished, that Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy couldn't stop the combined might of the British Empire and the United States. For a brief moment it seemed like the operation might work. The invasion was successful. Sicily was taken. And then, just when victory seemed assured, the whole campaign began to deteriorate into something far more complicated and far more costly than anyone had anticipated. General Alexander was the overall commander of the Mediterranean theater. He was a man who had won battles in North Africa. He was a man who had earned the respect of Churchill. He was a man who seemed, on the surface, to have everything required to be a great military commander. He was calm under pressure. He was politically savvy. He understood how to navigate the complex relationships between the American and British commands. He had the ear of the Prime Minister. But Alexander had a flaw that would become increasingly apparent as the Italian campaign unfolded. He was more interested in strategy than in people. He was more interested in how battles looked on a map than in how they felt to the soldiers who had to fight them. He was a man who could make decisions that cost thousands of lives and move on to the next meeting without losing sleep. When the Allies moved from Sicily to mainland Italy, crossing the Strait of Messina in early September 1943, the operation seemed straightforward enough. Italy was disintegrating. Mussolini had fallen. The Italian government was negotiating surrender. The German forces in Italy, though significant, were supposed to be in a weakened state. The plan was for the Allies to push north quickly, to overwhelm German resistance before it could be organized, to link up with Soviet forces eventually and end the war. It sounded good on paper. It sounded like a campaign that would be decisive and relatively quick. But Alexander, in his strategic calculations, made a decision that would have profound consequences. He decided to commit the Canadian First Army to the Italian campaign, but he decided to do so in a way that minimized their impact. The Canadians would be the exploitation force, the reserve that would be committed after the Americans and British had broken through German lines. They would be the tip of the spear, but only after others had already bloodied it. The Canadian soldiers who arrived in Italy in September 1943 didn't know they were being set up for abandonment. They were young men, mostly in their early 20s, from every province of Canada. They came from fishing villages and prairie towns, from mining communities and urban centers. They came from different backgrounds and different walks of life, but they shared something in common. They had volunteered to fight in a war. They had chosen to leave their homes and their families and their futures to fight for something they believed in. They believed they were fighting for freedom. They believed they were fighting to stop fascism. They believed they were fighting for a cause that was greater than themselves. And they were willing to die for that belief. When they arrived in Italy, the weather was still warm. It was September and the Mediterranean sun was still hot. The beaches where they landed were beautiful. The landscape beyond was dramatic and stunning. Soldiers who had trained in cold, wet Britain found themselves in a place that seemed almost Mediterranean, almost like a vacation at least on the surface. But beauty and war make terrible companions. The beauty of Italy only made the horror of what was happening there more striking. The contrast between the landscape and the violence made the violence more terrible. And as the Canadians moved inland, as they began to encounter German resistance, as they began to understand what Alexander had in store for them, that beauty began to seem like a cruel joke, like nature mocking the decisions of men who were willing to send young men to die for strategic objectives that might or might not be important. The German forces in Italy, despite the disintegration of the Italian government and despite being cut off from Germany by the distance and the Allied presence, were far from finished. They were led by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of the finest German commanders of the war. Kesselring understood terrain. He understood how to defend difficult positions. And he understood that Italy, with its mountains and valleys, its narrow passes and its difficult geography, was perfect for defensive warfare. The Allies could have all the superiority in numbers and material in the world, and Italy's terrain would still make their advance slow and costly. Kesselring began to establish defensive lines. He pulled back from Sicily, leaving rearguards to delay the Allies while the bulk of his forces moved to prepared positions. He understood that the Allies would eventually push north. He understood that they would eventually try to break through his lines. And he prepared for that moment with the thoroughness and professionalism that had made the German army so formidable. The Allies, unaware of how well prepared the German defenses were, or perhaps aware but underestimating the challenge, began their advance north from Sicily. The Americans, under General George Patton, pushed up the western coast of Sicily and then into Calabria on mainland Italy. The British, under General Bernard Montgomery, pushed up the eastern coast. Both armies encountered resistance, but both armies pushed through it. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Allies might indeed achieve the rapid breakthrough that Alexander had envisioned. But then they hit the first real German defensive line and everything changed. The German strategy in Italy was to trade space for time. They would pull back from each defensive line, inflicting as many casualties as possible on the Allies, slowing the Allied advance, buying time for their forces to regroup and prepare the next defensive line. It was a strategy that had worked in other theaters. It was a strategy that was suited to German strengths and Italian terrain. And it was a strategy that would force the Allies to grind forward slowly, paying in blood for every kilometer of ground. Alexander, faced with this grinding advance instead of the rapid breakthrough he had envisioned, made a series of decisions that would define the Italian campaign. He decided to push harder. He decided to commit more forces. He decided to accept higher casualties in exchange for faster progress. And he decided that the Canadian forces, which had been held in reserve, would be committed to the hardest fighting. The Canadians would be used as shock troops, as the forces that would be thrown against the strongest German positions, as the forces that would be expected to break through where others had failed. Alexander made this decision without consulting with Canadian commanders. Alexander made this decision based on his own strategic calculations. Alexander made this decision knowing that it would result in higher casualties. And Alexander made this decision without any real consideration for the lives of the young men who would have to implement it. The first time the Canadians were committed to major combat operations in Italy was at the Salerno beachhead in September 1943. The Americans had landed at Salerno expecting to find a relatively weak German presence. Instead, they found a German position that was far stronger than anticipated. The Germans counterattacked with forces that had been pulled from other parts of Italy. For a moment, it seemed like the Germans might push the Americans back into the sea. The situation was critical. Alexander made the decision to rush Canadian forces to Salerno to bolster the American position. The Canadians arrived exhausted from their march. They were committed to the fighting almost immediately, with minimal time to rest or reorganize. They were thrown into the most intense fighting at the beachhead. And they began to learn, in their very first major engagement in Italy, what Alexander had in store for them. The fighting at Salerno was brutal. The Germans were well dug in. They had the advantage of choosing the ground. They had prepared defensive positions. And they were commanded by officers who knew what they were doing. The Canadians, arriving exhausted and unprepared for the intensity of the combat they encountered, suffered heavy casualties. In a matter of days, the Canadian First Army lost hundreds of men. But they held the line. They prevented the German counterattack from succeeding. They saved the Salerno beachhead from being pushed back into the sea. And in the process they learned something about themselves and about their commanders. They learned that they were capable of far more than they had imagined. And they learned that those who commanded them were willing to spend their lives freely in pursuit of strategic objectives. After Salerno, the Canadians should have been rotated to the rear for rest and reorganization. That's what military doctrine recommended. That's what would have been the treatment of valued units that had just fought a desperate battle. But Alexander had other plans. He had received intelligence that the Germans were preparing a new defensive line further north. He had decided that the Canadians, having just proven themselves in combat, should be the spearhead for breaking through that line. The Canadians, despite being exhausted, despite having suffered heavy casualties, despite being undermanned and under-resourced, were ordered to advance north and prepare for the assault on the German position. What followed was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the Italian campaign. The Canadians would be committed to an assault on German defensive positions. They would fight with great courage and determination. They would suffer heavy casualties. They would eventually break through the German lines. And then they would be immediately committed to pursuing the Germans, trying to prevent them from establishing themselves on the next defensive line. There was no rest. There was no recovery. There was only the constant forward motion, the constant combat, the constant casualties. Alexander, sitting in his command post, reviewing maps and calculating how much ground could be gained in how much time, never seemed to consider the human cost of his decisions. He only seemed to consider the result. By the time the Canadians had been fighting in Italy for a few months, it became clear what Alexander's strategy really was. He was using Canadian forces as a battering ram. He was throwing them against German positions until the Canadians broke through. He was accepting casualties at a rate that, in any other context, would have been considered unacceptable. He was sacrificing Canadian soldiers with a frequency and a casualness that suggested he didn't really consider them to be his soldiers at all. He considered them to be instruments of his strategic vision, tools to be used up and discarded. And the Canadian commanders, increasingly aware of what was happening, found themselves in an impossible situation. They could refuse Alexander's orders, but that would mean abandoning the soldiers under their command to the consequences of that refusal. They could comply with Alexander's orders, but that would mean watching their soldiers die at a rate that exceeded anything they had anticipated. The Canadian soldiers themselves began to understand what was happening. They began to realize that Alexander didn't care about them. They began to realize that they were being sacrificed for strategic objectives that they didn't understand and that might not even be important. They began to talk among themselves about the casualty rates, about the constant combat, about the lack of rest or recovery. Some began to question whether the orders they were receiving made sense. Some began to wonder if their commanders actually cared about their survival. Some began to develop a kind of fatalistic attitude, accepting that they would probably die in Italy, that they were being sent to their deaths, and that there was nothing they could do about it except to do their duty and hope that somehow they would survive. But something else was also happening. As the casualties mounted, as the hardship increased, as the understanding that they had been abandoned grew deeper, something shifted in the Canadian soldiers. They began to fight not just because they had been ordered to fight, but because they were angry. They were angry at Alexander for treating them like disposable tools. They were angry at the German soldiers for representing everything they had come to Italy to fight against. They were angry at a war that demanded so much and gave so little in return. And that anger, that rage, that refusal to be broken by circumstances that seemed designed to destroy them, became a weapon that was as powerful as any gun or tank or artillery piece. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was brutal in Italy. The weather turned cold. Snow fell in the mountains. The supply lines became more difficult to maintain. Combat operations became more difficult. Soldiers died not just from combat but from exposure and disease and the general breakdown of human systems under the stress of continuous warfare. The Canadians, still being pushed forward, still being used as assault troops, still suffering casualties at unsustainable rates, began to develop a reputation among other Allied forces as virtually unstoppable. The reputation was based on the fact that the Canadians, regardless of the obstacles placed before them, regardless of the casualties they suffered, regardless of the apparent impossibility of their situations, kept advancing. They kept fighting. They kept breaking through German defensive positions. It wasn't that they were better trained or better equipped than other forces. It was that they were angry. It was that they had been abandoned by their commander. It was that they had nothing left to lose except their lives, and they had already accepted that possibility. It was that they had decided that if they were going to die in Italy, they would at least take as many Germans with them as possible. By early 1944, the Canadians had become the most feared assault force in the Mediterranean theater. German commanders, when they learned that Canadian forces would be attacking their positions, understood that they were facing soldiers who would not stop, who would not break, who would fight with an intensity that went beyond rational military calculation. The Germans began to refer to Canadian troops as the walking fury and the unstoppable force. These weren't compliments. These were descriptions of something that German commanders had come to respect and fear in equal measure. The Canadians had transformed their abandonment into a weapon. They had transformed their anger into a military capability. They had become something that even the disciplined and professional German army had difficulty dealing with. In early 1944, Alexander made a strategic decision that would change the nature of the Italian campaign. He decided that the Allies needed to break through the German defensive lines and advance rapidly north toward Rome. He decided that the Canadians, having proven themselves to be effective assault troops, would spearhead this breakthrough. He gave orders for the Canadian First Army to launch an assault on one of the strongest German defensive positions in Italy, the Winter Line, a series of fortified positions that the Germans had prepared over months. The assault was supposed to break the German line. The breakthrough was supposed to allow Allied forces to advance rapidly north. And Alexander, in his planning, seemed to assume that the Canadians would succeed, regardless of the difficulties involved, regardless of the casualties that might be incurred, regardless of the circumstances that might make success seem impossible. The Canadian commanders looked at the German positions and understood what Alexander was asking them to do. They were being asked to assault a well-fortified defensive line held by German troops that were well-prepared and well-supplied. They were being asked to do this despite the fact that their own forces had been depleted by months of continuous combat. They were being asked to do this despite the fact that they had been promised rest and recovery that never came. They were being asked to do this despite the fact that they had suffered casualties at rates that would have been considered catastrophic in any other campaign. But they gave the orders anyway. They committed their forces to the assault. They threw everything they had at the German defensive lines. And what happened next would become the most famous achievement of the Canadian forces in the entire Mediterranean theater. The assault on the Winter Line began at dawn on a cold, gray morning in early February 1944. Canadian soldiers, moving with the kind of coordination and determination that only comes from months of continuous combat, advanced into the German defensive positions. They moved through minefields and barbed wire. They moved through artillery fire and machine gun fire. They moved through machine gun fire and mortar fire. They moved forward despite casualties that would have broken other forces. And they broke through. They broke through the German defensive lines at multiple points. They established a breakthrough that the Germans couldn't plug. They created an opportunity for other Allied forces to exploit. And in doing so, they inflicted massive casualties on the German forces defending the Winter Line. The Germans, realizing that their position had been compromised, made the decision to pull back and establish themselves on the next defensive line. But as they pulled back, they were harassed relentlessly by Canadian forces. The Canadians, no longer constrained by the need to assault fortified positions, began to conduct pursuit operations. They chased German forces through the Italian countryside. They attacked German columns. They prevented the Germans from establishing coherent defensive positions. They kept the pressure on relentlessly. And as the Germans retreated, as they tried to establish new defensive lines, the Canadians were constantly there, constantly attacking, constantly preventing any kind of respite or reorganization. In the span of just a few weeks following the breakthrough at the Winter Line, Canadian forces inflicted approximately 100,000 casualties on German forces. Some of these were killed in combat. Some were wounded. Some were captured. But the total represented a catastrophic loss for the German forces in Italy. The German army, which had been able to sustain its defensive operations through a strategy of trading space for time, was suddenly unable to do so. The Canadians weren't allowing them the time they needed. The Canadians weren't allowing them to establish new defensive lines. The Canadians weren't allowing them to consolidate their forces and prepare for the next engagement. The German army in Italy, which had seemed like a dangerous and capable force just weeks earlier, was beginning to disintegrate. General Alexander, watching these events unfold from his command post, saw an opportunity. He saw the possibility of a complete breakthrough, a rapid advance to Rome and potentially beyond. He issued orders for the Canadians to continue their pursuit. He ordered them to move north as rapidly as possible. He ordered them to prevent the Germans from establishing new defensive lines. He ordered them to keep the pressure on relentlessly. And the Canadians, exhausted as they were, continued to comply with those orders. They continued to advance north. They continued to pursue the Germans. They continued to inflict casualties at unsustainable rates. But as the Canadians continued their pursuit, something began to happen that Alexander hadn't anticipated. The Canadians were beginning to run out of supplies. They had been advancing so rapidly that their supply lines couldn't keep up. They were running low on ammunition. They were running low on food. They were running low on fuel. The vehicles that had been transporting supplies were breaking down under the stress of rapid movement through difficult terrain. And the Canadians, despite these logistical challenges, continued to be ordered to advance. They were told to make do with what they had. They were told that supplies would catch up. They were told that the pursuit couldn't stop, that the Germans had to be kept off balance, that the opportunity for a complete breakthrough couldn't be missed. What Alexander didn't seem to understand, or perhaps didn't care to understand, was that soldiers can only function under a certain set of conditions. Without adequate supplies, without adequate rest, without adequate medical support, soldiers begin to break down. Physically they become exhausted. Mentally they become overwhelmed. Emotionally they begin to lose hope. The Canadians, pushed beyond these limits, began to show signs of breaking. Discipline began to suffer. Soldiers began to make mistakes. Morale began to decline. What had been an unstoppable force was beginning to show signs of human limitation. And then something unexpected happened. Some of the Canadian commanders, particularly those who had been with their units since the beginning of the campaign, those who had seen their soldiers suffer and die under Alexander's orders, those who had watched casualty rates climb to unsustainable levels, made a decision. They decided that enough was enough. They decided that they would no longer blindly comply with orders that made no military sense and that served no purpose except to demonstrate Alexander's strategic ambitions. They decided to push back against their superior commanders. They decided to argue for rest and reorganization. They decided to advocate for the soldiers under their command. They did this carefully, always couching their arguments in military terms, always respecting the chain of command, but they made it clear that they could not continue to drive their soldiers forward at the rate Alexander was demanding without risking the complete breakdown of their forces. Alexander, faced with this resistance from Canadian commanders, was forced to make a choice. He could relieve the Canadian commanders and replace them with officers who would comply with his orders without question. He could escalate the situation to Churchill and the British command structure, potentially creating a political crisis. Or he could accept the constraints that his Canadian commanders were placing on his strategic ambitions. In the end, Alexander chose the third option. He authorized a pause in the advance. He authorized Canadian forces to consolidate their positions. He authorized a brief period of rest and reorganization. But he also made it clear that this pause was temporary. As soon as Canadian forces had recovered, they would be committed to further operations. The window for rebellion against Alexander's orders was brief and narrow. It didn't change the fundamental relationship between Alexander and the Canadian forces. But it did establish that there were limits, that Canadian commanders would push back if asked to do the impossible, that the soldiers under their command couldn't be driven to complete exhaustion without consequences. When the Canadians resumed their advance after this brief respite, the nature of their operations began to change slightly. They were still aggressive. They were still pursuing German forces. But there was now a recognition that they couldn't maintain the pace indefinitely. There was now an understanding that rest and reorganization were necessary. There was now a tactical adjustment that took human limitations into account. And with this adjustment, the Canadians continued to be extraordinarily effective. They continued to inflict heavy casualties on German forces. They continued to prevent the Germans from establishing effective defensive positions. They continued to drive north through Italy. By the spring of 1944, the Canadians had played a significant role in the destruction of German military capability in Italy. They had fought in some of the hardest battles of the campaign. They had suffered casualties at rates that were higher than almost any other unit in the Mediterranean theater. They had done this while being given support and resources that were inadequate to the task that was being asked of them. They had done this while being commanded by a general who seemed to view them as instruments to be used up rather than as human beings to be protected and supported. And they had done this while watching their fellow soldiers die day after day, week after week, month after month. The casualty figures that emerged from the Italian campaign were staggering. The Canadian First Army had suffered approximately 92,000 casualties in total during the Italian campaign, from September 1943 to the end of the campaign in May 1945. That number includes killed, wounded, and missing. It represents approximately 230% of the initial Canadian strength in Italy. That means that Canadian forces had to be completely replaced and then reinforced again just to maintain the same combat strength. The unit had gone through soldiers at a rate that was truly catastrophic. And all of these casualties had been inflicted under the command of General Alexander, who had viewed them as necessary costs of achieving his strategic objectives. The German forces that faced the Canadians in Italy, by contrast, had suffered even worse. Approximately 100,000 German casualties were inflicted by Canadian forces during the Italian campaign. This number includes killed, wounded, and captured. It represents a loss that the German army, already stretched thin on multiple fronts, could not afford. The German army in Italy was severely weakened by the campaign. It had lost experienced soldiers and irreplaceable leadership. It had lost equipment and vehicles and weapons. It had lost the ability to maintain strong defensive positions. And much of this loss was directly attributable to the actions of Canadian forces. The question that historians have grappled with ever since is, was it worth it? Was the destruction of German capability in Italy worth the cost to Canadian forces? Was the advance north through Italy worth the casualties? Was Alexander's strategy correct, or was it a brutal and unnecessary waste of human life? There are reasonable arguments on both sides. One could argue that the Italian campaign was strategically important, that it tied down German forces that might otherwise have been used elsewhere, that it demonstrated Allied power and capability, that it showed that the Axis could be defeated. One could argue that the casualties, while high, were justified by the strategic results. But one could also argue that the Italian campaign was peripheral to the main theaters of war, that it diverted resources from more important operations, that the casualties incurred there could have been avoided if different strategies had been employed. One could argue that Alexander's willingness to accept high casualty rates was a reflection of his indifference to human life, a reflection of a military culture that valued abstract strategic concepts more than the lives of individual soldiers. What is certain is that the Canadian soldiers who fought in Italy understood what had happened. They understood that Alexander had abandoned them. They understood that they had been asked to achieve the impossible. They understood that they had done it anyway despite the abandonment, despite the impossible nature of the task, despite the casualties. They understood that they had transformed their abandonment into a weapon, their anger into military capability, their desperation into victory. And they understood that history would likely minimize what they had done, would likely emphasize the overall strategic results of the campaign rather than the specific cost to Canadian forces, would likely relegate their extraordinary achievement to a footnote in the larger narrative of World War II. When the Canadian soldiers returned to Canada after the war ended, they found a country that didn't fully understand what they had experienced. Canada had not been invaded. Canada had not been occupied. Canada had not had its cities bombed. The war had been something that happened elsewhere, something that involved Canadians but hadn't fundamentally changed the texture of Canadian life. The soldiers returned to a society that wanted to move on, that wanted to forget about the war, that wanted to pretend that the terrible things they had experienced hadn't really been that terrible. Many Canadian soldiers found it difficult to talk about their experiences. They found that people didn't want to hear about the killing, the dying, the constant fear, the abandonment by commanders who didn't value their lives. They found that society wanted to celebrate victory without acknowledging the cost of that victory. They found that the story of their sacrifice was quickly being replaced by other stories, other narratives, other interpretations of what World War II had meant. General Alexander, by contrast, returned to Britain celebrated as a great military commander. He was promoted. He was honored. He was given prestigious positions in the British military establishment. When he died in 1969, he was remembered as one of the great commanders of World War II, a man who had understood the nature of modern warfare and had adapted to it brilliantly. His reputation was largely built on his strategic achievements, on the fact that under his command, the Allies had advanced through North Africa and into Italy, that under his command Axis forces had been defeated in the Mediterranean theater. His reputation was not built on the specific human cost of those achievements, not built on the casualties that had been incurred, not built on the decisions he had made that had prioritized strategic objectives over human life. But historians who looked more closely at Alexander's record began to find something different from the popular narrative. They found that Alexander had been willing to accept casualties at rates that seemed excessive. They found that Alexander had not always made good use of the resources available to him. They found that Alexander had sometimes made decisions that seemed to be more about his personal reputation than about achieving military objectives in the most efficient way possible. They found that Alexander had displayed a kind of coldness toward human suffering, a willingness to see soldiers as abstractions rather than as human beings. And they began to question whether Alexander really deserved the reputation that he had been given. The Italian campaign itself began to be re-evaluated by military historians. Some began to argue that the campaign had been strategically marginal, that it had diverted resources from more important theaters of war, that it had been conducted in a way that was less efficient than other campaigns. They pointed to the high casualty rates, the logistical difficulties, the slow rate of advance despite the superior numbers and resources available to the Allies. They suggested that the campaign could have been conducted differently, more efficiently, with fewer casualties. They suggested that Alexander's strategy, while it had resulted in victory, had not been the best possible strategy, that it had been chosen partly because of Alexander's political relationships and his ability to convince his superiors that it was the right approach. The Canadian soldiers who had fought in Italy began to be recognized, decades after the war, for what they had actually accomplished. Historians began to study the specific operations in which they had participated. Historians began to analyze the casualty figures and to recognize that Canadian forces had been asked to do more than other forces, that they had been asked to achieve results that seemed impossible, that they had achieved those results despite the abandonment by their commanders. Historians began to understand that the Canadian First Army had been used in many ways as the sharp end of Alexander's strategic ambitions, that they had borne a disproportionate share of the burden of the Italian campaign, that they had paid a price in blood and suffering that was greater than necessary. What the Canadian soldiers had learned in Italy, what they carried back with them when the war ended, was something that can't be found in official military histories or in strategic analyses. They had learned something about themselves. They had learned that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they were pushed to the limit. They had learned that abandonment and betrayal could be transformed into determination and fury. They had learned that anger, when properly directed, could be a weapon as powerful as any gun or bomb. They had learned that soldiers from a young nation, from a nation that had entered the war as a junior partner in the Allied coalition, could perform at a level that matched or exceeded soldiers from older, more established military powers. They had learned that they were tougher, more resilient, more determined than they had ever imagined possible. The story of the Canadian soldiers in Italy is a story about what happens when ordinary people are pushed beyond their limits. It's a story about the consequences of command decisions that prioritize strategy over human life. It's a story about soldiers who were abandoned by their commanders and who chose to respond to that abandonment not with despair but with fury and determination. It's a story about how 100,000 German soldiers died as a result of the actions of Canadian soldiers who had been written off as expendable by their own command structure. It's a story about the gap between the official narratives of history and the truth that lives in the memories of those who experienced it. One could argue that the Italian campaign was strategically important, that it tied down German forces that might otherwise have been used elsewhere, that it demonstrated Allied power and capability, that it showed that the Axis could be defeated. One could argue that the casualties, while high, were justified by the strategic results. But one could also argue that the Italian campaign was peripheral to the main theaters of war, that it diverted resources from more important operations, that the casualties incurred there could have been avoided if different strategies had been employed. One could argue that Alexander's willingness to accept high casualty rates was a reflection of his indifference to human life, a reflection of a military culture that valued abstract strategic concepts more than the lives of individual soldiers. What is certain is that the Canadian soldiers who fought in Italy understood what had happened. They understood that Alexander had abandoned them. They understood that they had been asked to achieve the impossible. They understood that they had done it anyway despite the abandonment, despite the impossible nature of the task, despite the casualties. They understood that they had transformed their abandonment into a weapon, their anger into military capability, their desperation into victory. And they understood that history would likely minimize what they had done, would likely emphasize the overall strategic results of the campaign rather than the specific cost to Canadian forces, would likely relegate their extraordinary achievement to a footnote in the larger narrative of World War II. When the Canadian soldiers returned to Canada after the war ended, they found a country that didn't fully understand what they had experienced. Canada had not been invaded. Canada had not been occupied. Canada had not had its cities bombed. The war had been something that happened elsewhere, something that involved Canadians but hadn't fundamentally changed the texture of Canadian life. The soldiers returned to a society that wanted to move on, that wanted to forget about the war, that wanted to pretend that the terrible things they had experienced hadn't really been that terrible. Many Canadian soldiers found it difficult to talk about their experiences. They found that people didn't want to hear about the killing, the dying, the constant fear, the abandonment by commanders who didn't value their lives. They found that society wanted to celebrate victory without acknowledging the cost of that victory. They found that the story of their sacrifice was quickly being replaced by other stories, other narratives, other interpretations of what World War II had meant. General Alexander, by contrast, returned to Britain celebrated as a great military commander. He was promoted. He was honored. He was given prestigious positions in the British military establishment. When he died in 1969, he was remembered as one of the great commanders of World War II, a man who had understood the nature of modern warfare and had adapted to it brilliantly. His reputation was largely built on his strategic achievements, on the fact that under his command, the Allies had advanced through North Africa and into Italy, that under his command Axis forces had been defeated in the Mediterranean theater. His reputation was not built on the specific human cost of those achievements, not built on the casualties that had been incurred, not built on the decisions he had made that had prioritized strategic objectives over human life. But historians who looked more closely at Alexander's record began to find something different from the popular narrative. They found that Alexander had been willing to accept casualties at rates that seemed excessive. They found that Alexander had not always made good use of the resources available to him. They found that Alexander had sometimes made decisions that seemed to be more about his personal reputation than about achieving military objectives in the most efficient way possible. They found that Alexander had displayed a kind of coldness toward human suffering, a willingness to see soldiers as abstractions rather than as human beings. And they began to question whether Alexander really deserved the reputation that he had been given. The Italian campaign itself began to be re-evaluated by military historians. Some began to argue that the campaign had been strategically marginal, that it had diverted resources from more important theaters of war, that it had been conducted in a way that was less efficient than other campaigns. They pointed to the high casualty rates, the logistical difficulties, the slow rate of advance despite the superior numbers and resources available to the Allies. They suggested that the campaign could have been conducted differently, more efficiently, with fewer casualties. They suggested that Alexander's strategy, while it had resulted in victory, had not been the best possible strategy, that it had been chosen partly because of Alexander's political relationships and his ability to convince his superiors that it was the right approach. The Canadian soldiers who had fought in Italy began to be recognized, decades after the war, for what they had actually accomplished. Historians began to study the specific operations in which they had participated. Historians began to analyze the casualty figures and to recognize that Canadian forces had been asked to do more than other forces, that they had been asked to achieve results that seemed impossible, that they had achieved those results despite the abandonment by their commanders. Historians began to understand that the Canadian First Army had been used in many ways as the sharp end of Alexander's strategic ambitions, that they had borne a disproportionate share of the burden of the Italian campaign, that they had paid a price in blood and suffering that was greater than necessary. What the Canadian soldiers had learned in Italy, what they carried back with them when the war ended, was something that can't be found in official military histories or in strategic analyses. They had learned something about themselves. They had learned that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they were pushed to the limit. They had learned that abandonment and betrayal could be transformed into determination and fury. They had learned that anger, when properly directed, could be a weapon as powerful as any gun or bomb. They had learned that soldiers from a young nation, from a nation that had entered the war as a junior partner in the Allied coalition, could perform at a level that matched or exceeded soldiers from older, more established military powers. They had learned that they were tougher, more resilient, more determined than they had ever imagined possible. The story of the Canadian soldiers in Italy is a story about what happens when ordinary people are pushed beyond their limits. It's a story about the consequences of command decisions that prioritize strategy over human life. It's a story about soldiers who were abandoned by their commanders and who chose to respond to that abandonment not with despair but with fury and determination. It's a story about how 100,000 German soldiers died as a result of the actions of Canadian soldiers who had been written off as expendable by their own command structure. It's a story about the gap between the official narratives of history and the truth that lives in the memories of those who experienced it. General Alexander's decision to use Canadian forces as his assault troops, to accept casualty rates that would have been considered unacceptable in any other context, to prioritize his strategic objectives over the lives of the soldiers under his command. These decisions had consequences. They had consequences for the individual soldiers who suffered and died as a result. They had consequences for the families of those soldiers, families who lost sons and husbands and brothers and fathers. They had consequences for Canadian society, a society that had sent thousands of young men to fight and had gotten back thousands of traumatized survivors. And they had consequences for the course of the war, consequences that historians are still trying to sort out and understand decades later. But the Canadian soldiers who survived, who came back from Italy carrying memories of things they could never talk about, who spent the rest of their lives processing what they had experienced, who had to find ways to live with what they had seen and done and been part of, they understood something that most civilians would never understand. They understood that war is not an abstract strategic concept. War is personal. War is about specific decisions made by specific people that result in specific consequences for specific human beings. War is about young men being asked to do things that no human being should be asked to do, and then finding within themselves the strength to do those things anyway. War is about officers who care about their soldiers and officers who don't. War is about the difference between leadership that prioritizes human life and leadership that prioritizes reputation and strategic ambitions. The Canadians in Italy learned these lessons in a way that civilians sitting safely at home could never learn them. They learned them through experience. They learned them through suffering. They learned them through watching their friends die. They learned them through understanding that they had been abandoned and deciding to survive anyway, to fight anyway, to achieve the impossible anyway. And when they came home, they carried these lessons with them. Some of them went on to become teachers and told the story of what had happened in Italy. Some of them became writers and tried to document what they had experienced. Some of them went into politics and tried to ensure that future conflicts would be handled differently. Some of them simply lived their lives quietly, carrying the weight of what they had experienced, passing the knowledge down to their children and grandchildren. This is a story that deserves to be remembered. Not because it makes anyone look particularly good. Not because it resolves any of the great questions about military strategy or political decisions. But because it reminds us of something essential about human courage and determination and the ability to overcome circumstances that seem designed to destroy you. It reminds us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. It reminds us that the official narratives of history are often incomplete, often distorted, often minimizing the real contributions of specific groups of people. It reminds us that there are always stories within history, truths that live beneath the surface of official narratives, waiting to be discovered and told and remembered. The Canadian soldiers who fought in Italy didn't set out to be heroes. They set out to follow orders and to do their duty. But circumstances conspired to transform them into something more. They were abandoned by their commanders. They were asked to achieve the impossible. And they chose to respond to that abandonment and that impossible task not with despair but with determination. They chose to fight. They chose to advance. They chose to keep going when keeping going seemed impossible. And in doing so, they inflicted approximately 100,000 casualties on German forces. In doing so, they transformed the course of the Italian campaign. In doing so, they proved something about themselves and about human courage and about what ordinary people are capable of when they are truly tested. When people talk about World War II today, they often talk about the great commanders, the great strategies, the great turning points. They talk about D-Day and the invasion of Normandy. They talk about the Battle of Stalingrad and the Soviet victory on the Eastern Front. They talk about the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific. But they rarely talk about the Italian campaign. They rarely talk about General Alexander's decisions. They rarely talk about the Canadian soldiers who fought there. And they almost never talk about the 100,000 German soldiers who died as a result of the actions of Canadian forces. This is a story that has been forgotten, minimized, relegated to the margins of history. But it's a story that deserves to be remembered. It deserves to be told. It deserves to be honored. The Canadian soldiers who fought in Italy and who survived to tell the tale have mostly passed away now. The oldest of them are in their 90s. The youngest are in their 80s. They are living history, the last direct witnesses to events that happened more than 75 years ago. And with each day that passes, the risk of this history being completely forgotten increases. The risk of these stories being lost increases. The risk of these soldiers being remembered only as abstract statistics increases. This is why we tell this story now. This is why we remember the Canadian soldiers in Italy. This is why we ensure that what happened there, the abandonment, the courage, the determination, the sacrifice, the victory, is not lost to history. General Alexander abandoned the Canadian soldiers in Italy. He used them as instruments of his strategic ambitions. He accepted casualty rates that were catastrophic. He prioritized his reputation over their lives. But the Canadian soldiers responded to that abandonment with something that Alexander could never have anticipated. They responded with fury. They responded with determination. They responded with a refusal to be broken by circumstances that seemed designed to destroy them. And they slaughtered approximately 100,000 German soldiers in the process. They did this not because they were ordered to. They did this because they chose to. They did this because they were angry. They did this because they had decided that if they were going to suffer and die in Italy, they would at least ensure that their sacrifice meant something, that their suffering would result in German suffering, that their abandonment would be transformed into victory. This is the story of Canadian courage in Italy. This is the story of soldiers who were betrayed by their commanders and who overcame that betrayal. This is the story of ordinary men who became extraordinary through the circumstances they faced and the choices they made. This is the story of 100,000 German soldiers who died so that Canadian soldiers could prove something to themselves and to the world. This is a story that should be remembered. This is a story that should be honored. This is a story that should inspire us to think about the true cost of war, about the true nature of courage, about what we owe to those who serve and sacrifice in times of conflict. Remember these soldiers. Remember their sacrifice. Remember what they accomplished. And remember that this is a story that should never be forgotten.